When H.G. Wells' story The War of the Worlds was first published in 1897, it wasn't released as a book. Instead, it was a serial issued monthly in British publication Pearson's magazine, concurrently with the Cosmopolitan in the United States. As was common, an illustrator was hired to create art to go alongside the text, which in this case would involve producing the first ever visual depiction of the iconic tripods from the story. A depiction that H.G. Wells hated. Warwick Goble was a British illustrator who would go on to become highly regarded during his time. However, in 1897 he was relatively just starting out in this professional field and essentially was nobody of note. The task of portraying the War of the Worlds was one of his very first published works, but not quite his first, and he'd already done arts for Pearson's magazine previously. From what I've read researching this video, it was generally presumed that he was given this job mainly out of just having proven himself to at least be a competent illustrator with his previous contributions to the magazine. However, I did a little extra digging and discovered that he'd actually been paired with H.G. Wells even before The War of the Worlds was written. A year earlier, Goble had produced the illustrations for In the Abyss, a short story also written by Wells that was published in Pearson's magazine. This artwork is very nicely detailed in showcasing this underwater adventure. In particular, I like the way that two of the images seem to mirror each other, the two pieces working in tandem by portraying the fish people in the same position to the human. This is perhaps proposing via parallel perspectives that the fish guy's civilization is very much a civilization like that of the humans, which is also what Wells makes great effort to depict in the story, revealing that Warwick Goble doesn't just show what's going on, but uses his drawings in harmony with the goals that the author was trying to accomplish and backs them up further. As a result of this prior collaboration with Wells, I conclude that the editors of the magazine likely felt that the two were a good match for each other, and it makes sense that they'd continue to hire Goble and maintain this already established partnership of author and illustrator. The consequential initial watercolour works he did for The War of the Worlds are unfortunately lost, meaning that all we have left are the grayscale copies that appear in the magazine. It's interesting to consider what the original versions in colour might have looked like, and as a result I've attempted to give some of the pieces he did a bit of colour in a style that's intended to hopefully be somewhat reminiscent of his later works. The images are notable for their quite unique and arguably somewhat controversial design of the fighting machines, but I think that's kind of one of the things that's fascinating about the pictures. Warwick Goble's drawings are so interesting to me because it's the very first time anyone attempted to visualise this story, a story that would go on to have so many more portrayals to this very day. The tripods featured in The War of the Worlds have had innumerable interpretations over the decades, well literally over a century, and many of them are iconic. But these ones hold a unique pioneering status by being the very first. Well, actually the masthead of the issue that introduced the serial in Pearson's magazine was done by another illustrator, known as Cosmo Rowe, who seemingly depicts the silhouette of a Martian, or at least its heat ray by the looks of it. So technically that's the first depiction of the War of the Worlds Martians, although it isn't very clear. Weirdly though, the scan that I found of this version that appears in a Cosmopolitan omits this part for some reason. But Warwick Goble illustrates the rest of even this same edition, and drew the first clear portrayal of the fighting machines, which are shown to be very odd stiff structures with legs that resemble rigid human constructs. Trying to think of how these machines might move while being unable to bend their seemingly inflexible scaffolding legs is quite hard to imagine. It's like looking at a pylon, but it suddenly gets up and starts moving on its own somehow. My personal theory is that Goble based his depiction on a particular passage in the text regarding the movement of the machines. Can you imagine a milking stool tilted and bowled violently along the ground? But instead of a milking stool, imagine it a great thing of metal, like the body of a colossal steam engine on a tripod stand. Taken from this text, I suspect Goble's fighting machines were formed basically as it says, by taking a milking stool and making it a metal structure. But in particular, I take note of H.G. Wells' use of the phrase about it being tilted and bowled violently along the ground to describe its movement. Goble often presents his machines as being almost exaggeratingly tilted, which makes them appear very strange, almost cartoonish or comedic. Or at least, that's what I thought when I first saw them. I remember thinking, wow, this is a really weird design, and being confused as to how they're supposed to move. Combining this stance with Wells' description, however, conjures up in my mind the image of how this tripod must have moved, perhaps, which I've attempted to visualise myself here, using a model I just created quickly to try to show this. Unfortunately, I suck at 3D animating, so I don't think I managed to animate it quite how I was imagining the movement. But basically, genuinely just picture a stool being thrown along the ground and spinning as it kind of skips from each leg, if that makes sense. That's how I picture it anyway. Though how exactly can the tripods move like this, seemingly so static, without actually being physically bowled or persuaded in some way, it's not very clear. There doesn't appear to be much logic to the process in the drawings as to how it might work, but I think that might be the point. These are aliens that are meant to be completely beyond human technology and, more importantly, beyond our comprehension. Of course, my interpretations could be completely wrong. I'm just trying to bring some realisable reason to these rigid designs that are quite difficult to picture in motion. It's a design that I earlier called controversial, the reason being that H.G. Wells himself was very unimpressed with this design and disliked them a lot. To the point he sent a letter to his agent complaining about the result. And it's quite understandable why he might have felt this way, considering he outright mentions the fighting machine's ability to, bend their legs only 2 chapters later. The knees of its foremost legs bent at the farther bank, and in another moment it had raised itself to its full height again. Wells was so displeased that Goble had completely missed this detail and instead portrayed them effectively as kneeless structures that he went even further than just sending a letter. It was common publication procedure during this time for popular stories serialised to get a full release as a book after it had concluded in the magazine. And indeed, in 1898, the year after the story had been serialised, The War of the Worlds fully collected was finally released in book form. This new version, however, was significantly expanded on, and H.G. Wells wrote a lot of new material for this edition, and he decided to take this opportunity to add an entire paragraph expressing his immense displeasure at Goble's sketches. Amidst his recounting of the Martian domination, the narrator takes a moment to discredit the drawings, saying, "I recall particularly the illustration of one of the first pamphlets to give a consecutive account of the war. The artist had evidently made a hasty study of one of the fighting machines, and there his knowledge ended. He presented them as tilted, stiff tripods without either flexibility or subtlety, and with an altogether misleading monotony of effect. The pamphlet containing these renderings had a considerable vogue, and I mention them here simply to warn the reader against the impression they may have created. They were no more like the Martians I saw in action than a Dutch doll is like a human being. To my mind, the pamphlet would have been much better without them." The fact he outright mentions that the pamphlet containing these renderings had a considerable vogue, basically him from what I can tell pointing out that Pearson's magazine was very popular, shows how troubled he was by the fact that, as a result, many people would have seen the images, and consequently a great deal would have been potentially influenced by them into imagining the tripods in that way. An interpretation that clearly doesn't display the great flexibility and complexity of the machines that he had intended, instead having, as he says, an altogether misleading monotony of effect. From what I gather, I think this is basically saying Goble's designs are so rigid that they're boring due to not remotely conceivably appearing as animated as they should be, or even depicted as being capable of such abilities. As I previously mentioned, you can kind of see from certain pieces of text why Goble drew the tripods this way. I feel like you can really see where Goble got this idea of them from descriptions such as boilers on stilts. I mean, imagine trying to produce drawings from such a pioneering out there story with such an, at the time, unique premise, with absolutely no reference at all apart from the text itself. It must have been really quite difficult, and arguably Goble deserves credit for creating designs that are at least very distinct. But of course, it's simply a portrayal that contrasts with other descriptions in the story, suggesting that he really may have just made a hasty study of the machines from the text, as Wells suggests. Interestingly, while editing this video, I realised that this line, "Imagine it a great thing of metal, like the body of a colossal steam engine on a tripod stand," which is taken from the original serial, was changed in the book version to the simpler, "Imagine it a great body of machinery on a tripod stand." It makes me wonder if this line was changed due to Goble's drawings. The unfortunate thing is it's seemingly blatant by his later success that Warwick Goble wasn't a bad artist or anything. Even in this work, ignoring the tripods, he actually does a pretty good job of portraying what's going on in the story, and as others have pointed out, even expanding on it. An example being the scene where the shopman is pulled into the pit by the Martian. The book writes that the narrator sees the shopman's head bobbing up and down on the edge of the pit, but Goble goes a step further in his portrayal of this same scene by showing the full body of the man being ensnared and dragged down against his will by the tentacled creature, adding a whole level of horror and strong emotion into the picture. This is a staple of Goble's illustrations here, with him constantly generating and intensifying the chaos and dread that Wells was attempting to startle the Victorian readers with. Indeed, one of my favourite examples of Goble enhancing the feeling of the story is when he changes up the masthead for the final 4 editions. After Cosmo Rowe illustrated the title page for the first magazine, Goble created his own to use for the second issue that's very stark. It portrays the Martian's black smoke being penetrated by a central shard of light that reveals the ominous silhouettes of a dozen fighting machines, stacked together, giving a very chaotic feeling. This stacking of the fighting machines is a technique Goble uses in multiple pieces, and in my opinion it makes them seem incredibly intimidating. They're so in your face, blocking out the page with so many of them almost fighting for space on the picture. There's obvious flaws to this tripod design, but I will say that I think they're really quite dominating with how big and bold their main bodies are. The logo over the top almost reminds me of like sci-fi comic books, and the style of the font potentially is trying to portray it as very action-packed, but the deeply contrasted shading of the image with the tentacles segmenting the sky also makes it very horrifying. Just over halfway through the serial, however, he introduces a new masthead that truly emphasises the utter mastery of the Martian conquest and the hopelessness of humanity. The title now takes on a more serious tone, in a professional style written on the tatters of a ribbon that's been picked apart by a vulture standing on a human skull. It's like Goble said, let's just put together as many things that suggest death and decay as possible, creating such an impressively depressing collage to represent the dead or dying Earth under Martian occupation. Behind the vulture, the planet Mars looks triumphant, as it dominates the background while one of the tentacled Martians latches onto the masthead itself. This title page that's used from then on to the end of the serial visualises a total despair that perfectly matches the utterly pessimistic tone of the story, which was something Wells was criticised for, but arguably that was kind of the point he was trying to make. And that's why Goble's illustrations, with their showing high emotion of fear and panic, actually do quite a good job of illustrating the same themes and feeling of shock and hopelessness that are portrayed in the story. They should be praised, in my opinion, for once again being examples of Goble's ability to back up and reinforce the goals of the author. And H.G. Wells himself, actually a couple of decades later, would seemingly think so too. In a 1920 article he wrote in The Strand magazine about the various illustrated interpretations of the War of the Worlds that had been done, he went on to claim that the art was done very well by Mr. Warwick Goble during its first magazine publication. Reportedly, he even agreed to the use of the artwork in a proposed new edition of the book a few years before that statement. Some portray this as Wells having changed his mind from his previous criticism, but I think this actually doesn't necessarily suggest that. Considering the tripods are only present in around half of all the illustrations Goble did for the story, it's completely conceivable to me that Wells genuinely did think Goble did great work for it. He just strongly disapproved specifically of his depiction of the fighting machines. The two opinions can be held at the same time without conflicting with each other. It's important to remember the context of Wells' criticism. Goble's illustrations were the very first, and consequently at the time, only depiction of the fighting machines, meaning the only depiction that viewers could experience visually was one that Wells felt was in error and made the mistake of missing an obvious detail about the tripods. It's quite unsurprising that he'd have been quite paranoid about the pictures being released alongside his new story, a story that, although iconic now, was obviously brand new and unestablished at the time. Wells' reaction is even more understandable when you consider that, although he was already a highly regarded author, he was still a relatively new name, only having published his first novel a couple of years earlier. So, of course Wells wanted to dissuade Goble's tripods from being an image maintained in the reader's minds for the book version. But likewise, it's understandable how decades later, with the book regarded as one of his most iconic works to the degree of having so many more illustrations of the story produced by so many other artists, such as those done by Alvim Correa that Wells was massively enthusiastic about, it's understandable that by this point in time, Wells was far more comfortable soundly in the knowledge that Goble's artwork was just the first of many, many interpretations. When it's put like that, you can kind of understand why, despite disparaging the tripod depiction, many years later he'd approved that same work to be republished in a proposed new edition that didn't end up happening at the time. Instead, the final time Goble's images appeared in a publication of the War of the Worlds at that time was in some versions of the 1898 first edition book that was published in America, which meant, rather ironically if I'm using that word correctly, that his pictures appeared along with the paragraph discrediting them. The first edition originally published in the UK, however, was naturally without Goble's illustrations, and subsequently as other artists took up the mantle of contributing the artwork of later versions, the images fell into obscurity, not appearing in any version after 1898, until 2015, when a modern reprint of the story illustrated by Warwick Goble was released in the United States. Despite this rather interesting case early on in his career in which an author openly disapproved with his interpretation of the text, as previously mentioned, Goble later went on to be a very highly regarded artist, and his work would generally be cited as contributing to the development of fine colour books in the early part of the 20th century. He'd particularly garner fame for and be cited as helping create a golden age of illustrated children's books, becoming a household name during his life. It's quite remarkable that some of Warwick Goble's earliest published works now have a pioneering place in science fiction history by the unique distinction of being the first ever visual depiction of the War of the Worlds.